Decriminalizing mental illness is the right thing to do because it changes lives. We need to change our focus on punishing the symptoms to treating their cause. And I'm speaking to you in the context of crime and mental illness, okay? Now, in 1975, I think you see behind me, I hope, a set of jail cell entranceway gates. And I passed through those gates, and I learned three things ultimately. First, I learned that mental health services at that time, 1975, were essentially non-existent in prisons and jails. And I learned that the circumstances, this is one of my older photographs, but I couldn't find any really that illustrated what life is like in jails and prison. It's just awful. And those conditions are serious exacerbators of the symptoms of mental illness. And I learned, third, that for the mentally ill, prison is a life of terror. So much so, think about this, so much so that suicide is the largest cause of death among all inmates. Suicide is 34% of all inmate deaths. Think about what it would take for one of your children caught up in the law to commit suicide in prison. And that's where we are. Now, the Constitution has constraints on the power of government to intervene in the life of an individual who's gone off the tracks because of mental illness. It is the intersection between mental illness and crime that changes that constitutional balance and gives government the opportunity to intervene. Making the most of that opportunity is what we're about. We want to capture that moment. Now, when I say decriminalize mental illness, I am not saying that mental illness excuses criminal conduct. Hope that sinks in. I am not saying that mental illness excuses criminal conduct. I am saying that mental illness must inform how and when we respond to an individual whose illness is the root cause of recurring criminal conduct. And we must do that by identifying them at arrest, because those services of doing that aren't available, I just told you, in jail or elsewhere, on arrest, and then segregate them from the prison track and introduce them to the diversion track. Now, mental illness affects all taxpayers and every family without regard for whether or not it resides in any particular household. The cost of mental illness and incarceration can be reduced significantly if we remember three things. Number one, treating mental illness is significantly cheaper than long-term prison sentences. Number two, treating mental illness reduces recidivism, which the effect is fewer subsequent imprisonments and safer communities. And third, treating mental illness restores that individual to the workforce. It is estimated that the GNP is reduced as a consequence of mental illness and people being absent from the workforce by $193 billion every year. Now, government makes up that tax fall. How do they do that? How do they do that in your tax bill? Did you ever see that? You didn't see that, right? But you may have wondered why that happened. That's why it's happening. And guess what else? The services you receive for the taxes you reduce, what are happening to them? Okay? They decrease the services. So, how big a problem is this? 73% of all the women and 55% of all men in custody carry a mental illness diagnosed and recognized in the DSM. 40% of them have more than one. If our objective is to correct criminal behavior, then we must use tools designed to affect that purpose. And imprisoning the mentally ill does not do that. Okay? It just doesn't work out. So let me give you an example if we can go back one. I represented a family, and it was an 18-year marriage, and they had 2 very successful teenage children. And he was self-employed, making lots of money and paying lots of taxes. Had never been in trouble with the law. In 2006, he came down with viral meningitis. And it was a serious case, and the treatment was not entirely successful. He was left with permanent residual impairments, one of which, really strange but known consequence, was an altered personality. Anybody ever hear that? Altered personality. We got medical people out there. Manifested by chronic misdemeanor shoplifting. And after numerous encounters with law enforcement and victims, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. While he was awaiting transfer to his prison, he obtained a pair of scissors and stabbed himself in the throat, and that would have saved him everything, except they were able to get him to the hospital. Patch him together. He got those scissors from the infirmary. Why? Because prison is not a hospital. They don't design it with mentally ill people being there and in custody. They sent him to the institution where he was going to serve his sentence. And they knew about the suicide, so they put him on an observation cell. But contrary to standard operating procedures, the corrections officers did not remove the 8 feet of shoelaces he was wearing on arrival. So even though he was in an observation cell, the night shift never observed him. They just didn't have the staff to do it because it's a prison. They lock him up in the cell and that's the end of the matter. So instead of having 30 people on the ward, how many do they have? And so does he go over and check on him? No, but the day shift gets there and they pop the door open, and what do they find? A deceased husband, a deceased father, an absent taxpayer, having hung himself by his shoelaces from bars in the windows on his side of the plexiglass observation window. Now that's because they don't design prisons as what? Hospitals. Because what's more common in prison than bars in the windows? What's more lethal in a mental hospital than bars in the windows? And I might point out also that that same rule applies to personnel. It makes no sense to send EMS in response to a bank robbery in progress, or to send law enforcement to a mental health call unless they are summoned by EMS-trained people to talk that down who are on the scene. It doesn't work. They're not cross-compatible in facilities, and they're not cross-compatible in staff. Is that something that you can grasp? Okay? So for the price of a few $3 pills, we have all of those losses. And I might point out that you had to pay over $300,000 in damages in reconstructing the whole structure of that prison to try and have some part that equals a hospital, because they just will not stop warehousing mentally ill in what? Prisons. So what's the solution? This is a solution. It isn't simple and it isn't single, but it focuses on 3 things: innovative processes, techniques to manage the individual, to manage and treat the mental illness, and to manage the delivery of those services. Managing the individual is easy. It is by electronically monitored house arrest, which transfers 100% of the cost of detaining that person from the taxpayer to him and his family in a designated residence that's been qualified by court personnel as adequate for the purpose. Now, it's a 24/7 real time. If he departs from that house or from the designated route to work, or if he tampers with the device on his ankle, they know about it immediately, okay, and can put a fix on it. Okay, it comes with a remote, so all the caregivers can summon instant help with the push. They don't have to disengage from or make a phone call that's provocative. They can push a button. And there are in-home services, in-home visits, frequently unannounced by court personnel in pretrial services. They're monitoring it. Now, that manages in. What about managing the mental illness and treating it? That's our far greater and our greatest opportunity. The greatest task and our greatest opportunity. Most mentally ill people who are caught up in this entanglement with the criminal system are unidentified for their mental illness. They're unknown for that. And it's a cycle that's continuously unbroken. We have to have in place an assessment process where mental health is keyed in by the initial interviews at arrest as being a potential factor and get a mental health assessment. Anybody heard of one of those? You can get a person that's trained to do that, and if necessary, you can go up whatever levels need to be gone up. Neuropsych eval, if it's the first time through. And we can get a treatment protocol. And it may call for injectable medications because they're not compliant necessarily with the oral regimes. And they last 2, 4, sometimes 6 weeks. And we've got control over the medications. They're administered by home health care services. Anybody ever heard of that? So we've got all these opportunities to plug in. Okay? We are principally an advocacy group. And our purpose is to try and capture and redirect public attention and governmental policies towards this goal. And that is to recognize that mental illness is a health care issue and not a law enforcement issue.